of the timeline for what we're talking about. It doesn't matter how much you want to drink a soup or eat something. You have to wait for it to be well cooked. So what we are doing is making sure that all the things that have to be in place for the debt arrears, for debt arrears clearance, for the arrears clearance and debt resolution to be done. The last 6 meetings that we have had, there's so many things headwinds we had to deal with. First, we had to build trust across. Secondly, we have to make sure that there was consensus between IMF, the World Bank, and us on a trajectory towards that arrears clearance. Third, there was a lot of political issues, historical issues that had to be dealt with, for which you cannot move. It doesn't matter what your technical solutions are. The political context had to be dealt with, for which we needed the president to make important decisions. Fourth is that you also have to get a situation in which there was agreement among multiple players, all the way starting from the farmers whose land were taken, those who also lost their businesses. You also had those, the government had to also look through the reforms he had to do on that. And there were also issues of governance that have always been there about political governance, elections, human rights, freedom of speech. There was a lot of reforms that were needed. And so I want to correct an impression that the high-level dialogue is not been a series of just discussions. A lot of things have been done. Concrete things. You had it when the president spoke today. First is the president has been incredible. I don't know of any country where a president will attend a structured dialogue 6 times, right? Second is that this country has actually produced significant results on this dialogue. As I said, it's the only game in town. First, the Minister of Finance is here. He's done an incredible job on the economic side. The whole issue of making sure that the quasi-fiscal things of the Reserve Bank is done. The whole issue of making sure that the multiple exchanges that were run in this country sorted out. And those are not easy things to do, right? And plus, they have to also, in the middle of very, very tight fiscal space, manage inflation that was galloping inflation. And today, inflation is well under control. And so those are very, very significant things that have been done. On the political side, the issue is we're not going to have a debt resolution and arrears clearance unless particular things are done in terms of the PBO bill. Of course, as you know, there are a lot of things that have to do with the anti-debt penalty bill, the whole issue of tackling corruption, especially state-owned enterprises, and the government is doing an incredible job of putting that all together into a new fund, which you call the Mutapa fund, to be able to do that. That was done. But most importantly is that those farmers that were concerned, there had to be a structure to pay them. Look, what we decided to do when we started, we call it a central pin strategy. If you do bowling, right, in a bowling alley, if you bowl and you're looking straight at the pin right in front of you, if you hit that pin, you're good. Otherwise, you're going to be in the gutter all of it. The issue that got us to this impasse was that. And so we had to make sure that a framework was developed in which there was going to be compensation for the farmers, but also Zimbabwean farmers that also benefited from the land reforms had to have access or secure access tenure to their land. And again, part of the achievements here is 99-year leases that was done. The president talked about that today. The global compensation deed, which the government, in the middle of very difficult fiscal issues, found $35 million to be paying for, and it's 430 something farmers that you've cleared under the global compensation deed, and that 20 million farmers to pay those that are under the BPAS arrangement. So these are major accomplishments. Now we've reached a point now where, if you have a plane, you're going right through, cloud, you have to get out of the cloud. And then you can see a landing strip, then you can land. That's the only time you can land. Now we have a clear path for ourselves. First, that clear path will start in January of next year, with the Minister of Finance working very closely with the IMF for the development of this IMF staff monitor program. That is the key thing that starts off that landing process, right? That will come with a series of reforms which he will negotiate with IMF and all of that. What we have said as development partners is that we are going to be at the side of Zimbabwe to allow Zimbabwe to do those reforms and have the resources it needs to tackle whatever those impacts of those reforms on the population would be. So that is a very important part of it. The second part is that next year, the African Development Bank has what they call African Development Fund, which is the fund that we've used to clear arrears for other countries. We've done that for Sudan. We've done that for Somalia. So now that we have a clarity of that, we are going to be making a request to have a set aside during the African Development Fund 17 replenishment to allow for resources to clear the arrears of areas for Zimbabwe. And I think that I feel that that's why the African Development Bank, we also supported the government to recruit a global advisory firm and also the law firm, which is, I can just call them K&K because I don't remember.
It's a long, complex
name, but it's K&K, I just call them, which is now going to develop the structure, the timelines and everything. So we're looking at that very, very closely. So that's the plan that we have. Is we're going to be kicking off next year with that. And I think at the end of the day, if you take ice block out of a fridge and you put it out in the sun, what's clear is that eventually it's going to fall. And we've been in the thawing process and we're getting there. I'm very confident we're going to get there. The diplomatic community have been very, very supportive. All the ambassadors have been very, very supportive. IMF, World Bank, everybody's very, very supportive. So that's the timeline. So next year is what we are looking at. And I'm going to work as hard as I can to see that we can get this done before my time ends. It comes back to the question that was raised by the expectation. But the arrears clearance process is, as passionate as I am with it, it's not an additional issue. It's an African Development Bank issue. We cannot have a situation in which Zimbabwe is the only country that has been under all these arrears. It's in our interest to do all we can. So it's an institutional issue in which I'm providing leadership and I expect. First, let me just be clear that the Africa debt situation is not coming out of bad macroeconomic management or fiscal mismanagement. It's coming out of a whole series of headwinds that are completely out of control of the African countries. Look at a situation, COVID situation. While the developed world spent about $98 trillion, on that, Africa only spent $83 billion. So we still have a tapering effect of that COVID that is still there with us. Then you have climate change. That is, you are here in Zimbabwe, in which I understand agricultural output will fall by about 15%. Just because of that, right? You didn't cause all that, okay? They have to find the money to deal with that. Then you have a situation in which global inflation has actually come in, and the rising interest rate means that countries like Zimbabwe and others, the way in which they pay service there, that the cost continues to rise. And so today, what you have is that this year alone, Africa will have to spend $74 billion in servicing its debt. Now, 2010, that was just $17 billion. So you can see what has really happened. Now, in terms of how you deal with that, I think first is that it's the G20 common framework, which was set up, which will be basically to make sure that the creditors, the commercial creditors, which actually holds most of Africa's debt today, and the ones that are the concessional financier like ourselves, talk to each other about how to have a debt resolution issue. That's going on. It's happened for Zambia, it's happened for Ghana and Ethiopia, but it's slow. And the other challenge that Africa has is the overlapping debt payments because most of the debt is actually secured on Eurobonds, right? So you have today probably about almost more than 46% of Africa's debt being commercial debt, short-term debt, very high interest rate, and you have overlapping payments due. So the point I'm trying to make there is that we need to find a mechanism to avoid illiquidity becoming insolvency for African countries. And that is why the African Development Bank we're developing something called the Africa Financial Stability Mechanism, that will provide the buffers for Africa when it has this kind of external shocks, plus also the resources to refinance Africa's debt. You see, everything we talk about, Africa is the only region of the world that doesn't have, there's no refinancing facility for Africa's debt. Yeah. And so African countries will need to pay $20 billion today to refinance their debt. Next year, $10 billion, all of that. So we're creating the right financial structure to allow Africa to be able to refinance its debt. And the last thing that I want to say is I'll bring it back to Zimbabwe. As I said earlier, it doesn't matter how good you are. Arrears cannot become the new debt. If I'm paying my debt, I'm paying my debt on my principal and interest payments. But just because I'm constrained, I can't pay anything. The arrears, I think almost 90-something% is actually arrears. And so we cannot have that kind of a situation. That's why we're doing what we are doing here today. And lastly, and before I turn over to the minister, is the importance of concessional long-term finance. We cannot finance Africa's development with short-term financing. You need long-term, low-interest money, and that's what we do as multilateral financial institutions. And so we have a vehicle which is called the African Development Fund, which is mobilizing billions of dollars for that. We're going to have a replenishment for that vehicle next year, and I've set a target of it for $25 billion. Those monies will allow Zimbabwe and several other countries to have access to low-interest, long-term money to support their own development. All of that just to say that, I'll just close on this, that Zimbabwe can't fail. We've got to succeed. And that success is not going to be just a success for Zimbabwe. It's a success for the SADC region. It's a success for Africa. And as somebody who lived here, who walked here many, many years ago, I know the potential that this country has. It can't eat that potential. It has to unlock that potential. And that arrears clearance and debt resolution is what's going to free up to be able to do that. And we stand fully, 100%, beside Zimbabwe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That was a very comprehensive table. I can't remember who asked about the time.
Should go.
Yeah, that's right. I think there'll be 3 critical dates next year to watch. One is January, which is when we kickstart the staff monitor program of the IMF, the visit, concretizing on the targets. The other point will be in July next year, which is basically will be halfway through the SMP. Again, just to take stock in terms of where we are. We should be able to communicate as to what's happening during that process. The African Development Bank has funded a resource for communication purposes, so we should be able to communicate on that progress. And then finally, I would say September, October, again, is to take stock to see how the S&P is progressing, because that will be closer to the end of it. And so if we need to make some adjustments, make some adjustments. The aim is that it should be completed before the end of the NDS1 period, which is 31 December 2025. The whole S&P issues should be dealt with. But prior to that, we need an indication from 1 or 2 sponsors for giving us some bridge financing for the arrears clearance. That indication needs to be louder, or at least visible, needs to be declared midway through next year. So I would say June, July next year, we should have a good sense as to who this sponsor is. That's a necessary piece of the architecture in terms of arrears clearance. While the S&P is running, really we want to deal with this issue during the NDS1 period. So when we start with NDS2, on the 1st of January 2026, we're starting with a an economy that is free of the albatross of debt. And she asked a very good question about the debt issue overall in Africa. I want to be free of this so that we can access constitutional financing. In fact, speaking to that one, which really pertains to the last question, is that Africa needs financing at scale, that is concessionary, that is also long term, and that's what Dr. Adeshina talked about in terms of what the ADF, African Development Fund, does. So without this, we're unable to deal with the development gap that Africa is experiencing across a variety of areas. So this is necessary. So the ADF is a critical piece of Zimbabwe's arrears clearance. By getting this set aside done, it will allow us to clear our arrears. In addition to having a sponsor, one of the creditors has to come forward, step forward. We certainly will encourage one or two to do so. That was the case when Somalia cleared its debt arrears. So was the case with Sudan. Again, we had a sponsor. That's the architecture. That's how it works. Thank you very much.
Any comment on the Minister of Foreign Affairs before we close?
On farmer payments, we set aside 55 million for that in the national budget of this year. 20 million for the paper farmers, 35 million for the global compensation deed farmers. So that those resources are in place. What we're doing now was really going through the verification process to make sure that when you say I'm a farmer who is aggrieved, I need payment, it is you who really own that piece of land and where is that piece of land. So that verification process is critical. It took time. But we are ready now to start making the payments. But it's not that we've not been paying before. If we recall that every year, actually we've been paying the farmers, targeting the vulnerable and so forth. But what we didn't know was the extent of the debt. So by coming up with the global compensation deed and the agreements that we've done with the paper farmers, we now know what that liability is. But the process itself had already started. We just paused a little while we're completing the verification process, and that is done so that compensation anytime now they'll start receiving a payment. Then the other, what was the question now?
Or the impact
is living within our means. Absolutely. Eating what we kill. We've always said that's our mantra, to live within our means as a government. If you look at our track record since 2018, since we started, our average budget deficit to GDP ratio really has never exceeded 3% of GDP. In fact, this year we expect 1.4% of GDP to be the budget deficit debt GDP. We live within our means, but that means that we need to really exercise prudent fiscal management, tough, decisions. I think we have seen the recent Treasury circular. It's been covered quite a bit. Government has run out of money. No, we haven't run out of money. That's what is called proper, prudent fiscal management. When we say cut down on unnecessary expenditure, cut down on that workshop number 15 for the A, just cut back on that. You don't need to travel. We only have a month to Christmas. Where are you going? That's what we were doing. So really that's how we do things. So budget deficit will be 1.5% of GDP. So that's how we live within our means. Then on the resource mobilization front, we've done quite a bit in terms of domestic resource mobilization. The 2% tax is still there. Thank you very much. And then we introduced other taxes, the sin taxes, sugar content tax, cigarette taxes, and so forth. I'm just nuancing around the normal taxes or PAYE, VAT, customs, duty. Those are sources of revenue, and we track that very careful. But we want to keep enhancing that revenue base while managing our fiscal side. So we're doing the right things to stay within our means, and we always run a quasi cash budget system. It has served us well. You might think that maybe we've been too tight. I don't think so. Recall that the average rate of growth in the last 3 years, excluding this year, has been 6.8%. It's the fastest rise rate for any country in Southern Africa. So even under tight fiscal circumstances, we've done rather well. So it has served us well by providing the certainty that is needed. This year we are at 2%. Next year we're back at 6%. For the whole NDS1 period, 2021 to 25, we should achieve an average growth rate of 5.5%. And that's very good. It's dead on target. It's dead on target. Then the last one is, why don't you just get on and do debt restructure? Is that what I understood? All right.
I actually asked
is it?
restructure the external debt. I mean, is it that difficult? It's been done before in other countries. Zambia.
I think let me leave that to Dr. Adeshir. I have an answer. I'll answer all the questions. I think the last question was for me. What was it? Remind me.
The benefits of the SDP if successful.
Oh, the benefits are enormous. Then we can access, more concessionary funding through the fiscus, through government. At the moment, even the donor funding that comes through the country, very little, in fact, zero, goes through the national budget. It goes outside the national budget, managed by UNOPS, this agency, that agency, UNDP, and so forth. Because that's what happens when you're in arrears. No one wants you to manage money directly. It goes through. Then we have to work very hard to see if those resources are actually supporting the preferred or the priority development area. So we have to work hard. And yet if it came through the budget and it's concessionary, it's affordable, we'll know exactly how to use those resources. So the benefit in terms of access to additional resources to support budgetary needs are obvious. But also it will remain unmentioned, but we know them. But we should be able to achieve that. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Monica, for that. How much of the debt? You need to know how much debt it is. So having debt statistics, transparent, assessment of debt is very, very important. So if you're going to restructure anything, what are you restructuring? If you're having some debt that is actually not on your books, we need to know that. And so as we look at global debt issues, debt transparency is the critical thing, having the right data on debt. But having understood that, you have to also see what has happened in terms of the composition of debt. Because if you're going to restructure that, which debt are you restructuring? In a situation for Africa, for example, it used to be that the concessional debt given by ourselves, World Bank, and everybody else, like in 2010, used to be 54% of all the debt that exposures that African countries have. That concessional debt has gone down to probably about 24%, right? 2010, maybe 17% of it was actually a Eurobond debt, a commercial debt. Today, it's well over 47%. And so it is dealing with that, Here we are dealing here in Zimbabwe, not with the commercial debt. We're dealing with the issue of the debt that has arisen because of the sanctions. But it's mainly concessional multilateral debt that we are dealing with. But in dealing with that particular one, efforts are clearly being made. The G20 common framework that I mentioned to you, which is try to restructure the debt for Zambia, for also Ghana and Ethiopia are all part of that. But the thing is, it just takes forever, right, to be able to get the creditors to all agree on the frameworks that are going to, the commonality of treatment across bilateral creditors, multilateral creditors, and commercial creditors, and how much haircut they are all going to have. It's not a very easy process, but so that's why the G20 common framework for debt restructuring has been very, very slow. But even if you agree that you are going to restructure the debt, where will the money come to support the countries like Zimbabwe and others? And I would say three things. And first is we need to be smarter about using global conditional financing instruments, such as the special drawing rights. Special drawing rights of IMF, when it was issued, when we had COVID, $650 billion were issued in terms of the SDRs, but Africa got only $33 billion, about 4.5% of it. Now, here's the issue. I, at the African Development Bank, and my staff, we've made a case that why not have the special drawing rights SDR rechanneled to multilateral development bank also, in addition to the IMF's Poverty and Growth Reduction Trust and the Resilience Trust. What does that mean? As multilateral development banks that are credit AAA rated institutions, $1 of that SDR, we will leverage it, will become $8. Okay? So you have a 1 to 8 stretch. So we made a case for the IMF. IMF agreed, board agreed, and they approved up to $20 billion to be rechanneled to multilateral development banks, which we will use as hybrid capital, right? And so because we can use hybrid capital, that $20 billion will become $160 billion of low interest, long-term money that will support countries as they do the debt restructure. So that pool of capital. One thing, Professor Kube, I have to put that at the end. Yeah,
I'll allow you to proceed.
I can't do that. So I just put at the point at the end of it. It's living within your means. We're supporting him here in terms of public financial management. So public financial debt management, it's something that is very, very critical that they continue to do. And at the end of the day, I don't think development should be done only by just simply borrowing, right? No nation develops in the world by just simply borrowing money. Nations develop because they are able to spur economic growth and economic activities and growth, and therefore they mobilize domestic resources to be able to develop. And so at the African Development Bank, we're pushing for countries to continue to have a lot more of their own domestic resources to be able to support their own development. And that frees up the space for you to do what you want to do. And sometimes, let me say, give the liberty to do what you want to do without too much conditionalities that you get from us sometimes. Let me put it that way. And I think the question from Harold, about any partners that holding on to the past. Not that there's any particular partner that is holding on to the past. What I'm saying is that we can live in the past. We all know what Zimbabwe has gone through. Okay? We can't get stuck there. It's a big future for Zimbabwe ahead. And as I said, Zimbabwe will be very strategic to the world in terms of energy transition. Just to give you one statistic. The energy transitions in the world, that whether it's for electric vehicles or battery energy storage systems, they depend on critical minerals. Most of those critical minerals are in Africa. 90% of platinum is in Africa. You come here to Zimbabwe, you have platinum, metal group, you also have lithium, you have several other things. Graphite. The size of that market for electric vehicles by 2030 and battery energy storage system will be $7 trillion. That market will rise to $59 trillion by 2050. So what I'm saying, therefore, is, I'm from Nigeria. I'm a Yoruba person, as my ethnic group. We have a saying that says, the eye that cries must also see at the same time. Mm. So what I'm saying is, we've got to see the strategic importance of Zimbabwe in that global energy transition thing. And so it cannot be living in a past of retribution. It must be living in the future, the strategic, taking the strategic role, given the strategic role that this country will play. So I'm asking for new lenses to look at Zimbabwe.
Maybe a footnote on the multilateral debt or IFI debt, what is called preferred, institutions debt to the World Bank, FDB, European Investment Bank. Then we have got the bilateral debt. This is the Paris Club partners, UK, US, and then the third bucket is the commercial private sector debt. So in terms of debt restructuring, we're wondering, why are we not moving faster? We're moving much faster on the commercial debt. And that's how it works, actually. So already we received one nice, concession from one of the large creditors abroad, who is a private sector funder, which is allowing us to then apply that formula across most of the private sector debt. We got a debt payment moratorium. It's already in force as I speak. So already progress is being made. But the other two, the multilateral and bilateral, require this process that we're embarking on to be effective. So we're using all the tools to make this happen. But on commercial, we're moving a lot faster already.
Thank you. So, Honorable Prof. Mulira.
An upper middle income economy or better. But we have to have means to that. And one of the problems has been this one of debt over here. And the structured dialogue process is a very important instrument of engagement and re-engagement. Just to contextualize what we are doing, because sometimes when we are saying engagement and re-engagement, we are talking about them as words, but this is engagement and re-engagement indeed, I think.